During the 1840s, the United States had a significant increase in settlers, who abandoned their homes, in the East, to resettle in the Oregon Territory, which is actually California. At the time, the area was only accessible by a very long sea voyage, or a long, dangerous journey across the American frontier. Many were attracted to the West's economic opportunities. Some came for religious freedom, while others came for manifest destiny, which basically is the belief that the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans belonged to the European American people, and that they should inhabit it. Usually wagon trains followed the Oregon Trail route, starting at Independence, Missouri, to the Continental Divide of Americas. Typically, they could travel approximately 15 miles a day. The entire journey usually would take around 4 to 6 months. The trail followed rivers to South Pass, a mountain pass, which is in present-day Wyoming, which was fairly easy for wagons to navigate through. From that point, pioneers had a choice of different routes they could take to their final destinations. Lansford Hastings was one of the early migrants from Ohio to West. He went to California in 1841, and noticed the vast amounts of undeveloped land, and the promise that could bring. To drawing new settlers, he published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. As an alternative to the original Oregon Trail, through Idaho's Snake River Plain, he suggested a more direct route to California, across the Great Basin. This would take settlers through the Wasatch Range, and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. However, Hastings had never taken this route himself until 1846. Furthermore, during his travel on this route, he was not accompanied by wagons. With wagons it actually makes the trip much, much longer. As of 1846, Hastings was one of 2 men to ever have crossed the southern part of the Great Salt Lake Desert. In the spring of 1846, nearly 500 wagons headed west, from Independence. At the back of the train, a group of 9 wagons, containing 32 members of the Reed and Donner families and their employees. They left on May 12. George Donner was born in North Carolina. He had gradually moved west. In early 1846, he was approximately 60 years old and living near Springfield, Illinois. His 44-year-old wife, Tamsen, and their 3 daughters, Frances who was 6, Georgia who was 4, and Eliza who was only 3. Also, George's daughters from a previous marriage, Elitha, 14 years old, and Leanna who was 12. George's younger brother Jacob, who was 56, also joined the party with his wife Elizabeth, who was 45, and his teenaged stepsons Solomon Hook, who was 14, and William Hook who was 12, and his 5 children, George, 9, Mary, 7, Isaac, 6 and Samuel, 1. Also joining the Donner brothers were teamsters Hiram O. Miller, 29, Samuel Shoemaker, 25, Noah James, 16, and Charles Berger, 30, John Denton, 28, and Augustus Spitzer. James F. Reed was 45 years old and native of Ireland. He settled in Illinois in 1831. With him was his wife Margaret, 32, stepdaughter Virginia, 13, his daughter Martha Jane, known as Patty, 8, his sons James, 5, and Thomas, 3, and Margaret Reed's mother, Sarah Keyes. Sarah was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis, and passed away at the campsite they named Alcove Springs. She was buried off to the side of the trail, marked by a gray rock inscribed, Mrs. Sarah Keyes, died May 29, 1846, age 70. Reed was hoping the climate in California would help his wife, Margaret's, ill health and also to gain financial freedom. The Reeds hired 3 men to drive their ox teams, Milford, Mitt, Elliott, age 28, James Smith, age 25, and Walter Heron, age 25. They also hired Baylis Williams, age 24, as a handyman. With him was his sister, Eliza, age 25, who was hired as the family's cook. A week into leaving Independence, the Reeds and Donners also joined another group of 50 wagons, led by William H. Russell. By June 16, the parties had traveled 450 miles, and only 200 miles, before getting to Wyoming. They had been delayed by rain, and a rising river. However, Tamsen Donner wrote a letter to a friend, stating things were fine. Young Virginia Reed stated years later that the first part of the trip she was perfectly happy. Along the way, several other families joined the party. The Donner and Reed party now had a total of 87 members. Lansford Hastings sent riders to deliver letters to travelers, promoting his new shortcut called Hastings Cutoff. On June 12, the Reeds and Donners party was handed one of them. Hastings also warned travelers they could get opposition from the Mexican authorities in California, and told them to stick together in very large groups. He also advised that he would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide them along the new cutoff trail. On July 20, at the Little Sandy River, most of the people and their wagons opted to follow the well-established trail to Fort Hall. A smaller group decided to head to Fort Bridger, but they needed a strong leader. Most of the men in their group were European immigrants, and were not ideal leaders. James Reed had lived in the United States for a long time, was older, and his background included the military, but his attitude made him a poor choice. George Donner, on the other hand, was an American-born, peaceful, mature and experienced man, and due to his very charitable nature, he was the group's first choice as leader. Most of the members of the party were well off, and lacked experience and skills for traveling through arid and mountainous lands. Furthermore, hardly any had knowledge about how to interact with Native Americans. Edwin Bryant, a journalist, reached Black's Fork a week before the Donner party, and noticed upon first entering the trail, that it would be quite difficult for the wagons to make the route. He returned to Black's Fork, and left letters warning several members of the Donner party not to take the Hastings shortcut, that it was too dangerous for wagons. By the time the Donner party had reached Black's Fork, on July 27, Hastings had already left, leading the 40 wagons of the Harlan Young party. Due to Jim Bridges' trading post faring better if people used the Hastings Cutoff, Reed told the party that the Hastings Cutoff was a smooth trip, with no rugged country, and no hostile Native Americans, and that it would cut their journey by 350 miles. He also told them that water would be easy to find along the way. Reed advocated for the Hastings Cutoff, since the information impressed him. However, none of the party received Bryant's letter, warning them to avoid Hastings' route at all costs, according to his diary. Reed met an old friend named James Clyman, at Fort Laramie. He warned Reed not to take the Hastings Cutoff. He warned him that wagons would not be able to make the treacherous journey, and that Hastings' information was wrong. Jesse Quinn Thornton ventured part of the way with the Donner and Reed party, and wrote in his book From Oregon and California in 1848. He named Hastings the Baron Munchausen of travelers in these countries. According to Thornton's book, Tamsen Donner was gloomy, sad and dispirited at the thought of leaving the main trail, at the advice of Hastings, whom she called a selfish adventurer. The party left Black's Fork on July 31, 1846, and after 4 days of wagon repairs and rest. They were about 11 days behind the Harlan Young group. Donner hired a new driver, and several more joined the party. The party turned south, to follow the Hastings Cutoff. Within days they found the terrain to be more difficult than they were told. Drivers of the wagons were forced to lock the wheels to prevent them from rolling off step inclines. Several years of traveling on the Oregon Trail left a clear, cut-out path, but the Hastings Cutoff was difficult to find and navigate. Hastings left letters attached to trees along the way. On August 6, they found a letter on a tree, informing them to stop, until they can show them an alternate path to that taken by the Harlan Young party. Reed and a few others rode ahead to get Hastings. They ran into difficult canyons and boulders that had to be moved, and walls cut off to a river below, which would break wagons. In his letter, Hastings offered to guide the Donner Party around the more difficult areas, but he rode back only a small ways, indicating a general direction, by pointing, but never actually guided them as promised. Reed left his two companions to rest, while he quickly returned to the group, arriving 4 days after they departed. Without the guide they had been promised, the party had to make a difficult decision: do they turn back, and follow the track left by the Harlan Young party, through the difficult terrain of Weber Canyon, or do they continue on their own trail, in the direction Hastings suggested? At Reed's direction, they decided to continue on and follow the new Hastings trail. Their progress slowed to about 1.5 miles per day. All young men, who were able-bodied, had to clear brush, fallen trees, and rocks, to make room for the wagons. At this point, another party joined them, the Graves family. This brought the Donner Party to 87 members. On August 20th, they finally reached the point where they could look down and see the Great Salt Lake. It took nearly 2 more weeks to travel out of the Wasatch Ranger. Arguing amongst the men, some had doubts about the wisdom of those who had chosen this route. James Reed was the person the anger was pointed at. Some of the less fortunate families had ran out of food and supplies. The 2 men that had traveled out with Reed had gotten lost on their way back. By the time the party found them, they were almost to the point of eating their own horses to survive. The party came across a torn and weather-beaten letter from Hastings. They pieced it together. It advised that there were 2 days and nights of extreme, difficult travel just ahead, without water or grass. The party decided to let the oxen rest, while they prepared for the trip. After about a 36-hour rest, they set off, to traverse a 1,000-foot mountain that stood in their way. From the peak of this mountain, they spotted a dry, barren plain. It was completely flat, and covered with white salt, and much larger than the one they just crossed. It was one of the inhospitable locations on the earth. At this point, their water was nearly gone, and their oxen was worn. Having no other choice, the party pressed forward. The moisture under the salt crust rose to the top, and turned into a gluey mass. The wheels on the wagons sank into it, and in some cases, up to the hubs. The nights were freezing cold, and the days were unbearably hot. After only 3 days, all of their water was completely gone. A few took their oxen loose from the wagons, and forged ahead looking for water. Some of the animals were so exhausted and weak that they were left attached to wagons and abandoned. Of the 10 oxen that Reed brought with him on the trip, 9 broke free, and crazed with thirst, ran into the desert, never to be seen again. Many other families' horses and cattle had also gone missing. Some of the wagons took on too much damage and became unusable. Hastings had promised the journey across the Great Salt Lake Desert would take 2 days and 40 miles, instead it was 80 miles, and took 6 days. The party now had no faith in the Hastings cutoff. They spent several days recovering at the springs, on the other side of the desert. They transferred food and supplies to other wagons, and tried to recover cattle and wagons left in the desert. Reed sustained the heaviest losses, and became more assertive, asking all the families to give him an inventory of their food and goods. He also suggested that 2 men should journey ahead to Sutter's Fort in California, since he had heard that John Sutter was a generous man who would send extra provisions. William McCutcheon and Charles Stanton undertook the dangerous trip. The remaining wagons were pulled by odd teams of cows, mules, and oxen. It was now the middle of September, and it was soon reported that there was another 40 miles of desert ahead. Their oxen and cattle were lean and tired, however, the Donner Party persevered over the next part of the desert. They followed the weeks-old tracks of Hastings, despite their utter hatred for him at this point. The party had no other choice but to continue on. On September 26, 2 months after starting on the Hastings cutoff, the Donner Party finally regained the traditional trail that was later known as the Humboldt River. The so-called shortcut had not lessened their time, but added a full month to it. By the Humboldt River, the party ran into Paiute Native Americans, who journeyed with them for a few days, but during those few days they stole or shot several of their horses and oxen. By this time, it was October, and the families lit off to journey much faster. A couple of wagons in the other group became entangled, and John Snyder angrily beat the ox of Reed's hired hand, Mitt Elliott. When Reed tried to break it up, Snyder began hitting him in the head with a whip handle. When Reed's wife tried to stop this, she was also struck in the head. Reed ended up stabbing Snyder in the collarbone. Later, witnesses gathered around to decide what needed to be done. The laws of the United States were not applicable west of the Continental Divide, and in most cases, wagon trains would handle their own justice. The party's leader, George Donner, was a day ahead of them with his family. Witnesses seen Snyder hit Reed and his wife, but Snyder was popular among the people, and Reed was not liked. One even suggested that Reed be hanged, but eventually they decided Reed would be banished, without a gun or food. His family would stay, and be taken care of. The next morning, he was sent out alone, without any supplies, food or a gun. However, his stepdaughter, Virginia, secretly rode ahead, and gave him a food and a rifle. Grass was becoming extremely scarce, and the animals were steadily weakening. To relieve the animals, everyone was now expected to walk. Reed caught up with the Donners, and took one of his hired hands, Walter Heron, and ventured on. The two jumped on one horse, and were able to ride 30 to 40 miles per day. The rest of the party finally caught up to the Donners. With grass hard to find, the cattle were spread out more than usual. This allowed the Native Americans to steal 18 and shoot 21. At this point, the party had lost a combined total of 100 oxen and cattle, and their food was nearly gone. With most oxen gone now, many families were forced to walk and carry their children. This became more and more difficult without food and water. Another stretch of desert lay ahead of them, but they made it through. The party found the Truckee River, which was full of green, lush vegetation. The party couldn't rest long, since they had to press forward to beat the snow. One of the two men, who was sent ahead to California to bring back supplies, made it back. He brought mules, food, and 2 Miwok Native Americans, named Luis and Salvador. He also told them that Reed and Heron had made it to Sutter's Fort, in California. At this point, the Donner Party thought the worst was behind them, since they had endured so much more than any other pioneers had at this point. The party was faced with one last push over mountains, that were described as far worse than the previous. The company had to make a decision, to push ahead, or allow their cattle to rest. It was October 20th, and they were advised that the snow didn't come until mid-November. When a member of the party was killed accidentally by another when loading his gun, this gave them the push to just move forward. One by one, the family started up the mountain with the Donners being last. After a few miles of very rough terrain, one of the wagons broke an axle. Donner's son darted into the woods to find a replacement. After finding one, George Donner began chiseling the wood, and cut his hand while doing so, although not a deep cut. At this time snow began to fall. Some of the families made it all the way up the almost vertical slope, to Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, and camped near a cabin that was previously built by another group of pioneers, a few years ago. Eventually all were at the Truckee Lake, except for the Donners, who were 5 miles away, below them. 60 members were camped there. 3 cabins of pine logs served as their homes. The floors were made of dirt and the roofs were poorly constructed, and leaked. The Donner family made tents to house the 21 people with them. On November 4th, the snow began again. By this time the food that was brought back from Sutter's Fort was nearly gone. The oxen began to die, and their carcasses were frozen and stacked. The families were now growing desperate. They reasoned that it might be more successful in navigating the pass without wagons. Several attempts were made in small groups, but each time they came back unsuccessful. The storms kept coming. One storm lasted so long that their only remaining horses and cattle died and became fully engulfed under the snow, and couldn't be found to eat. Life at Truckee Lake was horrific. Inside the cabins was filthy and cramped. It snowed so much that people were trapped inside for several days at a time. Their diet ended up consisting only of raw hides, and boiling the leftover bones of their dead oxen, over and over to make soup, until it eventually became so brittle it crumbled. Several members of the party began to die from malnutrition and starvation. Desperate, on December 16th, Franklin Graves made makeshift snowshoes, out of oxbows and hide. A party of 17 men, women and children ventured out, on foot, to try to cross the mountain pass. They lightly packed, taking a small amount of rations, a rifle, a blanket each, some pistols, and a hatchet. They were hoping to make it to Bear Valley. The awkward snowshoes were effective on the treacherous climb, but they soon became snow-blind. They became confused, and lost, and ran out of food. After a few days without food, one of them suggested someone should volunteer to die, in order to feed the others. Another suggested they should make a lottery, to pick who should be sacrificed. However, in the end, they decided to keep going until someone died. However, the blizzard held them in their place. Eventually one of them died, a hired hand, and the group was forced to consume their human flesh. Eventually they had eaten all the flesh, and nothing remained. As the blizzard worsened, one of the members became delirious. He started ranting, stripped off all his clothes, and ran into the woods. He came back but died just a few hours later. As each member died, they would strip the muscles and organs from the bodies, and dry them to store for the days ahead. Again they attempted to push forward, but again they ran out of food, and began dismantling their snowshoes, to eat the oxhide webbing. They talked about killing and eating the 2 Native Americans with them, Luis and Salvador, but another member of the party warned the two, and they quietly escaped on their own. After several days, they came across the 2 Native Americans, starving and nearly dead. One of the party shot and killed them, for food, thinking they were their last hope for salvation. Just a few days later, the party came across a Native American settlement, that was in near ruins. The inhabitants ran, but came back, and gave up all their food, which was just small amount of acorns, grass and pine nuts. With the help of the tribe members, one of the members found a small farming community in Sacramento Valley. A rescue was sent out, and found the remaining 6 survivors of the ones who ventured out with snowshoes. Meanwhile, James F. Reed had made it out of Sierra Nevada in late October. He was recovering at Sutter's Fort, but was growing more and more concerned for his family and friends. He begged and even offered to fight in the Mexican-American War if Colonel John C. Fremont would just gather a team of men to cross the pass, and help the party. Much of the military and able-bodied men in California were fighting in the war. Throughout the area, supplies were unavailable, many roads were blocked, and communications were faulty. Only 3 men answered the call for volunteers to rescue the Donner Party. Reed was stuck in San Jose until February due to the war. During that time he rallied interest in the Donner Party, which eventually led to locals creating a petition to appeal to the U.S. Navy, to help the people of Truckee Lake. Since the Snowshoe Party had arrived, local newspapers had reported about how they had to resort to cannibalism, which also helped foster sympathy for those who were still trapped. Residents of Yerba Bueno, recent migrants, were able to raise money, and organize two parties, for a rescue for the Donner Party. The first rescue party started on February 4 from the Sacramento Valley. A swollen river from rain forced several delays. The team pushed forward, making steady progress through the snow and storms to cross the pass to Truckee Lake, carefully stashing food at stations along the way, to lessen the load. A few of the rescue party turned back, but 7 members continued on. On February 18, the 7 men scaled Fremont Pass, now known as the Donner Pass, and neared where the cabins should be. They began to shout out. A woman appears from a hole in the snow. She stared at them, and asked if they were from California, or if they came from heaven. The rescue party handed out food in tiny portions, due to concerns overeating may kill the emaciated group. The cabins were all buried in snow. The oxhide roofs were rotten, and the odor radiated the area. 13 people at the camp were deceased, and their bodies were loosely buried in the snow, near the cabin roofs. Some were emotionally unstable. 3 of the rescuers traveled to the Donners, and brought back 4 children and 3 adults. All emaciated. George Donner's arm was so gangrenous, he could not be moved. The rescue party chose 23 people to journey back, and left the remaining 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake. And another 12 at Alder Creek. Some of the migrants seemed emotionally unstable. 3 of the rescue party trekked to the Donners, and brought back 4 gaunt children, and 3 adults. Leanna Donner had particular difficulty walking up the steep incline, from Alder Creek to Truckee Lake, later writing, "Such pain and misery as I endured that day, is beyond description." George Donner's arm was so gangrenous, he could not move. 23 people were chosen to go with the rescue party, leaving 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake, and 12 at Alder Creek. On their way, the rescuers found that their first cache of food had been eaten by animals. They had to go 4 days without food. After struggling to walk, one of the children soon slipped into a coma, and died. Another child died not long after. After several more days through difficult terrain, the rescuers became concerned that the remaining children would not survive. Some of children ate the buckskin fringe from one of their pants, then their shoelaces. On their way down the mountain, another rescue party was coming up. In that party was James Reed, when his wife, who was one of the adults being rescued, when she heard his voice, she sank in the snow overwhelmed. Once this group made it to Bear Valley. One of the children rescued was Jacob Donner's stepson, William Hook. He broke into the food stores and overate, which resulted in his death. On March 1, the second relief party arrived at Truckee Lake. These rescuers were veteran mountain men, including John Turner. No one at the Truckee cabin had died since the last rescue party left. However, some of the occupants were mentally deteriorated. One was carrying a human leg, and when the rescuers made their presence known, he threw the leg in a hole. In the other camp, George Donner was very ill, the gangrene had reached his shoulder. His wife was fine. This time 17 were rescued from Truckee Lake, only 3 of which were adults. Only 5 remained at the Truckee camp. At the other camp, George Donner and his wife Tamsen, and her 3 daughters remained. She refused to leave him since he couldn't walk out, and she was told that another rescue party would be there very soon. She kept her 3 daughters with her. The journey back to Bear Valley was slow. A forceful blizzard arose after they scaled the pass. One child froze to death, and Reed nearly died himself. One child was so badly frostbit that she unknowingly burned her feet severely when they ended up in the fire while she slept. When the storm passed, some of the members were too weak and lethargic to get up and move, so the rescue party had no choice but to leave them behind. Later, one woman and her son died before the next party could reach them. The rest resorted to eating their flesh, to keep from starving. 3 members of the relief party had stayed back to help those who remained at the camps: Charles Stone, Charles Cady, and Nicholas Clark. While Clark was out hunting, Stone made plans with Cady to return to California. Tamsen Donna had arranged for them to take her daughters, Eliza Georgia, and Frances with them, and offered to pay them $500 cash. Stone and Cady took the 3 girls to Truckee Lake, but left them in the cabin, with those 5 waiting for rescue. 2 survivors of the snowshoe party, William Foster and William Eddy, started from Bear Valley to intercept Reed. They brought with them a man named John Stark. After a day, they met Reed helping his children struggling toward Bear Valley. All were bleeding, and frostbitten, but alive. The men were desperately wanting to rescue their own children. Foster and Eddy were able to persuade 4 men to go with them to Truckee Lake. On the way, they came across the 11 survivors that were left behind previously. 2 of the rescuers, each took a child, and headed to Bear Valley. John Stark refused to leave the others. He picked up 2 children and all the provisions, and assisted the remaining adults to safety, sometimes carrying one child for a while, then putting that one down and carrying another, until they all reached safety. Foster and Eddy finally arrived at Truckee Lake on March 14th. They found their children all dead. At the same time Tamsen Donna arrived at Truckee Lake to see her children. She had the choice to leave with them and be rescued, but she chose to go back to her husband, since he was still alive. They told her that it would be quite some time before anyone could make it back, but she refused and went back to her husband. Her daughters were rescued. On April 10th, nearly a month after the last rescue had left Truckee Lake, a party was organized, to recover what they could of Donna's belongings. These would be sold, and the proceeds would support the orphaned Donna children. The party found the tents all empty, only the body of George Donna remained, who had died only days earlier. Of the 87 people who entered the Wasatch Mountains, only 48 survived. The story of the Donna tragedy quickly spread. Newspapers across the country printed diaries and letters and accused the travelers of cannibalism, bad conduct and even murder. The survivors had different viewpoints on what happened. Some blamed Hastings for the deadly so-called shortcut, while others blamed James Reed for not listening to the warnings given about the deadly route. Today, Donna Lake is a popular resort near Truckee, California. The Donna Camp is a National Historic Landmark. A monument has been erected, in honor of all who made the difficult journey across the western plains and mountains to reach California. This can be seen at Donna Memorial State Park. Thanks for watching. Please keep your eye out for more videos just like this one. And be sure to subscribe, like and share.